Hello, I hope you're doing great. Today I want to let you know some of the additional enhancements that we have added to the Blazor restaurant project. So, there are a couple of things. Here we will find that you will be able to load Power BI reports or a specific report. Actually, it's the errors reports in Power BI, right? Currently we are just using a test report because we haven't created the one for this specific project, but it will just be a matter of changing the URL. So basically what we did is we created an errors Power BI.razor page and its corresponding razor.cs, or the code behind, some people call it, right? It's just a normal class as the rest of the project, right, of the pages. It's only for administrators, and it has a router is defining a constant, right? Then we inject a couple of services, the Toastify service and the HTTP client service. This one for the notifications, and this one for the access to the server. Then we create the authorized HTTP client based on the service, right? And we request the Power BI URL from the server, right? Then we assign it to the report URL and we render it in the page, so when the URL is not empty, the iframe will be displayed with the report. So that's for the Power BI report. We added a link for that report in the administration menu, right? We also added a couple of things. We added what it's called external request error tracking, which basically allows you, or it will allows us to track all of the HTTP requests that the PTI.microservices library is being executing. In this case, since we are using the Azure Map service, the library internally logs the request in the log that has been passed in the as dependency injection or in the constructor for the Azure Map service. Actually, most of the services in that library do the same because they use the custom HTTP client handler, right? And the custom HTTP client handler has the logic to log the HTTP requests that are being executed, right? So in case you want to know what's the actual HTTP request that was executed at some point, as well as the response of that request, this is the way that you will do it, right? In this case, we configure the automap for this from the custom HTTP client handler request response model, which is defined in the PTI.microservices.library, and it maps to the external request tracking, which is the name of the entity that corresponds to the database table, right? And we use convert using because there are some of these that are not of the same type, right? For example, request URL is an URI, but in the databases or in the entity is a string, right? So we convert that. The HTTP status code is an enumeration, but we have it as an integer for the database, right, or in the entity. So we did that. Then we have the configuration controller, which receives the system configuration, right, and the dependency injection, and the endpoint get errors log Power BI URL just retrieves the URL from the configuration, right? This one, this configuration is actually in the app settings. It could be modified or extended so you get it from the database or some other place, right? Okay, then we implemented the custom logger, right? The way we did it is you create a new class which implements the IL logger of the custom HTTP client handler, right? You receive the service scope factory and the mapper using dependency injection, right? And then in this case you can create like a new scope in here, right? But most of the examples actually return null, so you can do that, or that in some custom logic in there, return an ID disposable and then dispose it. Is enabled, it's always set to true at this moment, right? But if you, when you register, uh, you could do something like in the constructor receive the log level that this logger is going to allow, right? Save that as a variable in here, and then this enable will compare the value of this parameter against the variable that is stored. If they match, it will return true, otherwise it will return false, right? So far we only return true. Okay, and then the log state, right? This will come with different levels, right? It will come like information, exception, etc., right? Since this is a specific for the custom HTTP client handler, that one is only logging information mode or level for the HTTP requests, right? So basically what you can do is you deserialize, well, you get the message, you format it, right? Then if the log level is equal to information, you deserialize the message so it converts to the actual model entity or type. Then if the model has value, has something, right, you create a new scope, right, and then you get the required service. In this case we get the database context, we get the entity, we can use automapper, that's why we configured before, so the entity is automatically mapped using that .map. And then we add everything to the we add the entity to the change tracker or to the external request tracking change tracker table, and then we save the changes so they are persisted in the database, right? One of the other things we did is if we go to the save as sync, you see that this Blazor restaurant this file, which is the Blazor restaurant db context.partial.cs, is a little bit extended. By the way, before we continue, please remember to subscribe to the channel, share the channel, invite your friends, and help us keep growing. Also visit the links that are in the video description. Okay, so yeah, this class is a partial class for the database context in order to have an additional constructor which will receive the iCurrent user provider as a parameter, right? And we will set it in the configuration, right? This iCurrent user provider is what will allow us to get the user name, right? So you see that all of the save changes are actually overridden, and we are always invoking the validate and set defaults, right? So in the validate and set defaults, one of the things we are doing is if the entities are if there are entities of type iOriginator.info, we get these values, and the username is going to be retrieved from the current user provider, which is of the iCurrent user provider interface that we defined before, right? And then it iterates through all of the entities, and if one of these entities is of iOriginator.info, it sets the values. So if those values weren't filled before, they will be automatically filled with information that was retrieved from here, right? And here is the role creation user, which was defined up here, and it got the information from here, right? the current user provider class, which implements the iCurrent user provider, basically receives the HTTP content accessor, right? And the get username implementation gets the current user using the HTTP context accessor. And if a user exists and has an unknown name, we will return the name. Otherwise, we will return unknown, right? And that will persist the data in the database. This is the class for the system configuration, which will eventually be extended to have more properties in there. We added a new constant, which is the errors log power BI URL, right, or route. The interface, right, the error log table, it has that, right, the error log table dot partial. This partial is basically to make sure that that class implements this interface, right? And we do it in partial because the entities are actually auto-generated, so we will lose this if we do it in the other class. This is the external request tracking entity, right? It has all of that information, right? A lot of those values can be null, but some can't, right? We also make sure that this one implements the iOriginator info. We created the table, right? Here is the table definition, right? You can also see the script on here. And then we also have to go to the startup.cs and make some changes in there. We had, of course, adding the usings for some of the additional things that we are implementing. We had to add a transient for the iLogger for custom HTTP client handler, custom HTTP client handler logger. I believe it could also be scoped. I'm not totally sure about that one yet. I'll test it. We use a singleton for the HTTP content accessor class, right? And we add a scope for the iCurrent user provider and map it to the current user provider. We also set the DB context to use. See that we remove the add DB context from here, and instead we move it to the scope, right? And the logic for that one will return the context from this method, create BlazorRestaurant DB context, which passes the services collection, right? Then in here we added a singleton for the system configuration. Here is the definition for the create BlazorRestaurant DB context. You see that it returns this. It receives the services. I have to change the name for this one actually. I have to change that. Instead of using P, use services as the name. And basically what it does is use the DB context options builder to create the actual context instance, right? And now below here it will we also had to modify the code to create the instance when the error with the global exceptions handler is being executed, right? So basically we need to call this method too and pass the services which come from the actual context of this context, right? And that's basically it. Thank you very much.